So the book is structured so that on the right-hand page, there's a graph showing progress across time or change across time, a variety of different trends, let's say. The first trend is the great enrichment. And tell us what that means and what it signifies.
So the chart, which you may be able to show at some point in the future, looks like a hockey stick, which is to say that for all of our recorded history, let's say going back 4000 BC, but we can estimate even further back in time. There it is, the hockey stick of human prosperity. The line has flatlined. It is estimated that prior to the Industrial Revolution in the late 17 and early 1800s, global economy grew by about 0.1% per year, which is to say that to double your prosperity would have taken thousands of years. As late as 1900, which is to say the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, Queen Victoria was on the throne, the globe produced roughly $3 trillion in output. This is all inflation adjusted. So $3 trillion in output, the entire globe. In 2018, it was $121 trillion. So from $3 trillion to $121 trillion in a scope of 100 years adjusted for inflation. And if the growth that we have experienced, the growth rate that we have experienced over the last 100 years continues into 2100, the world will produce $600 trillion in output, real inflation-adjusted output. Over the next 80 years, the globe could produce 6 times more value than it is currently producing if we maintain the current economic growth rate.
And do you think that's an optimistic projection or a conservative projection?
That's what leads us back to the original point that we discussed. It very much depends on economic policies and political stability. If you don't have civil wars around the world, then and government change hands in a peaceful and predictable way, then we should be okay when it comes to political stability. When it comes to economics, we are seeing as surprising and, to be frank, surprising and almost inexplicable renewed interest in more restrictive economic policies, from socialism on the left to hardcore protectionism on the right. And if our economic growth rate falls from 1.82% that we have experienced over the last year to 0.1%, which we have experienced over the previous 10,000 years, then it will take us 6,000 years to get from $100 trillion to $200 trillion.
So the most remarkable thing about this is exactly the hockey stick shape. It's, as you pointed out, nothing at all happened until the mid 1800s, essentially. And then all of a sudden, things improved so rapidly that it's virtually incomprehensible. It's a miracle.
It is the most important question in economics. What happens in the late 1700s, early 1800s that produces that hockey stick effect? And just to clarify, there have been in human history periods of economic efflorescence, flourishing, but they were usually restricted to small parts of the world, and they usually petered out. So, for example, Song China has produced some remarkable technological discoveries, and it appeared to be at a time of relative plenty compared to other countries in the world. But that petered out when Song dynasty was replaced by the Ming dynasty. Similarly, the Roman Empire appears to have been a place that was largely at peace internally and quite prosperous, but that came to an end in 467 or whenever that happened, when Rome fell. So there are these periods that you can have prosperity. Also, let's stay with Europe. I mean, Europe has experienced the greatest century of peace and prosperity between 1814, the end of Napoleonic Wars, and 1914, the breakout of the First World War, which slaughtered tens of millions and destroyed a lot of wealth. So, economic progress can certainly take a knock, and it can take a time to recover. But in order for it to recover, you have to rediscover the reasons why you had high economic growth rates in the first place.
So, okay, so the first lesson is that something happened in the last 150 years that propelled human productive capacity and distribution globally into the stratosphere. And there's no sign that that's slowing, although we could disrupt it. And we could disrupt it because we don't exactly understand why it happened, and we're not appreciative enough of its miraculous nature and the perhaps fragile preconditions for its continued existence.
Well, when I said that it's the biggest question in economics, I'm not suggesting that there aren't theories of why it happened. Mm-hmm. The theory that I espoused, and the theory that has convinced me, is that over hundreds of years, in Western Europe and in North America, and then later in other parts of the world, our economic and political institutions have grown more inclusive, open, or to use a political word, liberal. Now, I'm using liberal in its European sense, mm-hmm. not liberal in the current American sense. And what that meant was that you no longer needed a permission from the king in order to open a shop or import a bag of wool from another country.
So there's an autonomy, there's an element of autonomy, but there's also an element of generosity that autonomy leads to increased productivity, but the consequences of the production are also being shared, and rather than hoarded, they're being distributed reasonably well.
Yes, but the key here was, I think, that monarchies, governments have become more responsible to their people, more accountable to their people, and they started allowing a much greater level of economic freedom. Now, the reason why that happened is a very interesting one. Once again, I'm going to tell you a theory that I espouse and theory that convinced me. Other people may have other ideas. But basically what has happened is that unlike in other parts of the world, such as the Ottoman Empire and such as China, Europe never had an internal empire. One dynasty was never able to conquer different European states into the creation of one European mega empire. And because governing elites of different states, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Holland, Belgium, whatever, because they wanted to survive, because they didn't want to be vassals of another monarch, because they wanted to remain independent, they realized that they needed to generate a lot of economic growth internally, and they realized that the only way that they could generate economic growth was through technological innovation. And technological innovation you can only get into in societies which allow people a relatively great degree of intellectual freedom. And so countries which felt at most threatened, such as Holland, because the French were always trying to take them over, would welcome into their cities and into the country thinkers from all over the world, free thinkers from all over Europe, who established themselves there, produced new ideas, produced new technologies, and Holland could defend itself against the predation of other countries. England was another example of how this happened. So it is through geopolitical competition, in other words, the dismemberment of European countries, that you get greater appreciation of the need for freedom, which then leads to innovation, which then leads to generation of more money, which then can keep your country independent and from being swallowed by a foreign conqueror. But if you want to reduce it to one sentence, it would be political and economic institutions became more open, inclusive, and liberal. Whether you were a Jew, or whether you were a Muslim, or a Christian, or a Catholic, you could function within the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, and nobody, and you were free from prosecution.